I should have trusted my instincts the moment we pulled off the highway and onto that narrow, cracked road leading into the forest. It was an old road, barely maintained, the kind where the paint had long since faded and the edges crumbled into the dirt. Tall trees lined both sides, pressing in, their thick trunks and tangled branches casting deep shadows even though the sun was still up. It felt like the road was swallowing us, cutting us off from the world we had just left behind. Me, my brother Ryan, and his two friends, Jake and Chris, were looking for a secluded place to camp for the weekend. Ryan had heard about a spot deep in the woods, far from any designated camping areas. It wasn't on any official maps, just a place whispered about by a friend of a friend, the kind of spot people bragged about finding but never gave exact directions to. That should have been another red flag. The road turned into dirt about 5 miles in. We had to slow down as the truck bounced over ruts and rocks. It was getting late, the sun dipping low, casting everything in a burnt orange glow. The forest here was thick, the kind where even during the day it felt like dusk. The deeper we went, the more I felt that strange pressure in my chest, like the air was heavier, thicker. Finally, after another mile, we found the clearing. It was small, maybe 20 feet across, with just enough space for the truck and a fire pit someone had used before us. The trees formed a perfect wall around it, towering and silent. The place had an eerie stillness to it. No wind, no rustling leaves, no birds. Just the sound of the truck engine clicking as it cooled and our boots crunching on dry twigs and dirt. We set up quickly, eager to get a fire going before it got too dark. The moment the sun dipped below the trees, the temperature dropped fast. The fire was a relief, its flickering light making the shadows dance around us. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional crack of wood shifting in the fire. That first night was when things started to feel off. It began with small things. The sound of twigs snapping just beyond the firelight, like something moving, watching. Ryan joked about deer, but I noticed he wasn't laughing much after that. Then there were the whispers, faint, just on the edge of hearing, like wind through the trees, but there was no wind. I told myself it was just my imagination, but my skin was crawling, and I wasn't the only one feeling it. Chris kept glancing over his shoulder. Jake stayed closer to the fire than usual. Ryan, always the skeptic, said nothing, but I caught him staring out into the dark more than once. We went to sleep in the tent around midnight. The ground was hard, the air freezing, but exhaustion won out. I woke up sometime later to the sound of movement outside. Not heavy, not loud, but steady. Slow footsteps circling the tent. I held my breath, listening, my heart pounding so hard I thought whoever, or whatever, was out there would hear it. I waited for one of the others to wake up, but no one stirred. The footsteps continued, pausing, then moving again, crunching through the dead leaves. I swallowed, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't random movement. It was deliberate, slow, calculated. Then it stopped. Complete silence. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back into uneasy sleep. Morning brought no answers. There were no tracks, no signs that anything had been near our tent. But the feeling didn't go away. The air was thick with something unspoken, an unease none of us wanted to admit. We decided to stay one more night. A mistake. That evening, while gathering wood, I found something about 50 feet from our site. Pile of bones. Small ones, scattered, cracked, and stripped clean. At first, I thought they were from a rabbit or squirrel, but as I looked closer, I saw something that made my stomach turn. Among the animal bones was something else. A human tooth. I backed away slowly, my hands sweating despite the cold. I didn't tell the others right away. I didn't know how to. What would I even say? That I found a tooth in the woods and suddenly wanted to leave? They'd laugh, tell me it was nothing, that maybe some animal had dragged it here. I swallowed the rising panic and kept quiet. That night, the sounds returned. Louder, closer. The footsteps weren't circling this time. They were approaching. I gripped the handle of my knife inside my sleeping bag, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then came the breathing, just outside the tent, slow and deep. Ryan shifted, whispering, "Do you hear that?" I nodded even though he couldn't see me. The breathing continued, inches from where I lay. I could feel it, a presence pressing in, waiting. Then the zipper moved, just a fraction. I shot up, scrambling for the flashlight. The second the beam hit the tent wall, the sound vanished. The footsteps ran, fast, heavy, back into the trees. No one slept after that. At dawn, we packed up, moving quickly, the tension thick between us. I didn't care about breakfast, about cleaning up. I just wanted to go. As we drove away, I looked back once, just once. Standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind the trees, was a man. He was watching us. His clothes were dirty, his face gaunt. And as we rounded the bend, disappearing from view, he took a step forward. We didn't speak until we hit the highway. No one wanted to admit what we already knew. We weren't alone out there, and we never should have come. It wasn't my first time. I grew up camping with my dad, learning how to build a fire, purify water, and navigate without GPS. I knew how to survive, but being alone in the woods isn't the same as going with a group. The silence is different. It's not peaceful. It's thick, pressing, alive. I felt it from the moment I stepped out of my truck and looked into the endless stretch of trees ahead of me. I had picked a remote site in a national forest, hours from the nearest town. No cell service, just me, my tent, and whatever was out there. I planned for a 3-day trip. My pack was heavy, full of supplies, enough food, water filter, first aid, a knife, and my .45 just in case. I hiked in about 5 miles before setting up camp. The spot was perfect, flat ground, near a stream, surrounded by thick trees. The first day went fine. I collected firewood, set up my tent, and cooked some canned chili over the fire. The stars were bright, and the air was cool. Everything felt normal. It was the second night when things changed. I woke up to the sound of movement just outside my tent. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but the steps were slow, deliberate. Too heavy for a raccoon, too cautious for a bear. I held my breath and listened. Then silence. Nothing moved for what felt like an hour. My heart pounded in my ears. I thought about unzipping the tent to check, but something in my gut told me not to. I lay there, gripping my knife, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I found footprints near my camp. Human. They weren't mine. I wear size 11 boots. These were smaller, maybe a size 9, and the tread was different. The prints circled my tent, stopping just a few feet from where I slept. My stomach turned. I wasn't alone. I told myself it was a hunter passing through. That made sense. But deep down, I knew no hunter would creep around someone's tent in the middle of the night. I considered packing up and leaving, but I'd come all this way. I wasn't about to let paranoia ruin my trip. So I brushed it off and stayed. Big mistake. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept the fire going longer than usual, hoping it would keep any unwanted visitors away. But around 2 a.m., I woke up again. This time, I didn't hear footsteps. I heard breathing. It was close, right outside the thin fabric of my tent. Slow, steady breathing. I felt frozen, my body refusing to move. My mind screamed at me to grab my gun, but I couldn't make myself do it. Then the zipper moved. It was subtle, just a tiny tug, like someone testing it. My fingers finally wrapped around my knife, and I sat up fast, making as much noise as I could. The breathing stopped, then running, footsteps crashing through the woods, fast, retreating. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and shined the light into the trees. Nothing, just the forest, dark and endless. I barely slept after that. I stayed up, gun in my lap, listening. The woods stayed quiet until dawn. The next morning, I made a decision. I was done. I packed my gear in record time and started the hike back to my truck. 5 miles never felt so long. Every crunch of leaves made my skin crawl. I kept checking behind me, half expecting to see someone following. But the trail remained empty. Then, about a mile from my truck, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A piece of fishing line stretched across the trail at ankle height. I stopped cold. My eyes followed the line to the trees where it was tied off. A tripwire. My mind raced. Was it for an animal? A snare? But then I saw another, a few feet ahead. 2 wires, different heights. No hunter sets traps like that. Someone was trying to catch me. I stepped over the lines carefully, scanning the trees. I didn't see anyone, but I felt them, watching, waiting. I gripped my gun and walked faster, heart pounding. My truck was in sight now, parked just off a dirt road. I almost ran. I didn't care about looking scared anymore. I just needed to get out. As I reached my truck, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were fresh boot prints in the dirt, leading from the woods to my truck. Someone had been here, waiting. I unlocked the door, jumped in, and locked it behind me. My hands shook as I started the engine. I didn't waste time. I threw it in reverse, spun around, and tore down the road, not looking back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never camp alone again. I never wanted to go on this trip. My brother, Nate, had been hounding me about it for months, saying I needed to get out more, clear my head. I didn't argue much. I had nothing better to do, and honestly, I just wanted some quiet. So when the time came, I packed up my gear, loaded it into his truck, and let him drive us out to some remote place deep in the woods. We arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was still high, but the trees swallowed most of the light, casting long shadows over the dirt road. We parked near a small clearing, an old campsite with a half-rotted picnic table and a rusted fire ring. It looked like no one had used it in years. That should have been my first warning. Nate was all energy, unloading the truck and setting up the tent like he'd been waiting for this moment forever. I took my time, stretching, looking around. The woods were silent, unnervingly so. No wind, no birds, no distant sounds of animals moving through the brush. Just us and the trees. The first night was uneventful. We made a fire, cooked some food, and sat around talking. I didn't feel like drinking, so I let Nate have most of the beers. The night air was cold, but the fire kept it manageable. Around midnight, we crawled into our sleeping bags, and that's when I noticed how truly dark it was. Even with the fire smoldering outside the tent, the blackness was thick, pressing against the nylon walls. I shut my eyes and told myself to sleep. I woke up sometime later, heart pounding, my body stiff. It was that feeling you get when something wakes you up, but you don't know what. I listened. Nothing. The dead silence was still there. No wind, no rustling leaves, just thick, heavy quiet. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent as slowly as I could. The fire was just glowing embers now, barely giving off any light. I scanned the area with the beam. Trees, the truck, the picnic table, nothing unusual. but I had that feeling, that deep, gut-level certainty that I was being watched. I told myself I was just spooked. The quiet was weird, sure, but maybe the woods were just like that sometimes. I zipped the tent back up and forced myself to sleep. Morning came, and Nate was already up, making coffee over the fire. I didn't mention the night before. No reason to. We spent the day hiking, fishing in a small river about a mile from camp, just killing time. It was peaceful enough, but something about the place still felt off. The silence hadn't changed. No barges, no buggies, no wind. It was like the forest was holding its breath. That night, it got worse. I woke up again. Same feeling. My heart was hammering before I was even fully awake. I didn't move at first, just listened. And then I heard it. A single, heavy footstep outside the tent. Not an animal. Not some small thing scurrying through the brush. It was deliberate, slow, and close. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to move. I didn't even want to blink. Another step. Closer this time. I reached out and shook Nate's shoulder, but he didn't wake up. He was breathing slow and deep, still lost in sleep. I tried again, harder. He grumbled, half turning over, but didn't wake. Then the noise stopped. I waited, ears straining, body locked up so tight my muscles ached. Nothing. The silence stretched on for so long that I started to wonder if I imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay there, stiff and alert, waiting for the sound to come back. It never did. Morning came and I felt like a corpse. My head pounded, my back ached. I told Nate what I heard, but he just laughed it off, said it was probably a deer or some other animal. I didn't argue, but I knew what I heard, and it wasn't a deer. That was the last full day we spent at the campsite. We hiked again, but I couldn't enjoy it. I felt exposed out in the open. I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something standing at the tree line. The whole time, that awful silence remained. That night, I made sure the fire was big, let it burn longer than before. I didn't care if we wasted all the wood we gathered. I just needed light. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke up, I knew immediately something was wrong. The fire was out, not just burned down, completely out, like someone had poured water over it. The air was thick with the smell of wet ash. And then I saw the footprints. Not mine, not Nate's. A third set, circling the campsite, pressed deep into the dirt. The steps were heavy, wide apart, like whoever made them was big. They led up to our tent, stopped just inches from the entrance, then turned and disappeared into the trees. Couldn't breathe. My skin went cold, my hands numb. I reached out and shook Nate awake hard this time. He sat up groggily, rubbing his face, but I grabbed his arm, forcing him to look. He sobered up fast. We didn't say much. We just packed up. We didn't even eat. Threw everything in the truck and left as soon as there was enough light to see the road. Neither of us looked back. We didn't talk about it for a long time, but I know he remembers. I saw it in his face that morning. I saw the fear. I don't know who or what was out there with us. Maybe it was some lunatic living in the woods, watching us, waiting. Maybe it was just some local messing with us for fun. But I can tell you this, I have never gone camping again, and I never will. I don't think I'll ever go camping alone again, maybe not even with people. I don't know what happened out there, but I know I don't ever want to feel that way again. It was supposed to be a simple trip. 3 nights alone in the woods. I wanted the quiet, the break from everything. My job was draining me, and I felt like I was losing myself. The idea of being alone with nothing but the trees and a fire sounded like exactly what I needed. I chose a spot deep in the national forest, miles from any official campsites. I parked my truck on a dirt pull-off and hiked in about 4 miles. It was beautiful. Tall pines, thick underbrush, the kind of deep woods that make you feel like the rest of the world doesn't exist. I found a clearing near a small stream, set up my tent, and got a fire going before it got dark. It was peaceful. No cell service, no people, just the sound of the wind and the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. The first night was fine. I listened to the sounds of the forest and let my mind settle. I didn't realize how much noise filled my daily life until it was gone. The quiet out there wasn't empty, though. The trees creaked, leaves rustled, and every so often, something moved in the underbrush. But that's normal. I'd camped enough to know that animals are always moving at night. I slept fine, better than I had in weeks. The second day was when things started to feel off. I woke up early and decided to hike a bit. I followed the stream for a few miles, enjoying the cool morning air. Around noon, I turned back. That's when I noticed it. A tree, stripped of its bark in long, jagged strips. The wood beneath was rough and splintered like something had clawed at it. I'd seen trees marked up before, usually by bears, but this didn't look the same. The gouges were deep, too deep, and spaced strangely. Not the way an animal would scratch. I told myself it had to be natural, maybe lightning or disease, but something about it made my skin crawl. I got back to camp and tried to shake it off. I made lunch, read for a while, and just sat by the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The woods felt different. The air felt heavier, and the silence was deeper than before. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing something. Not close, but not far. Footsteps? Maybe, but they weren't steady. They came in bursts, 2-3 steps, then nothing for a while. Then again, a little closer. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer moving cautiously through the trees, but it didn't feel right. I stayed in my sleeping bag, staring at the tent walls, listening. Hours passed. Every time I started to drift off, I heard it again, closer. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to the first light of dawn filtering through the tent. I unzipped it slowly, my stomach tight with unease, and stepped outside. The fire was dead, just cold embers, and everything looked normal. But then I saw the footprints. Not mine, bare feet. The prints circled my camp, stopping just a few feet from my tent. They weren't large, but they were deep, like whoever made them had been standing still, pressing into the dirt. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. No one should have been out here. I was miles from any trail, deep in the woods where no one just wanders. And why barefoot? I packed up my camp faster than I ever had before. My hands shook as I rolled up my sleeping bag and shoved everything into my pack. I kept looking around, expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. But there was nothing, just the quiet, the same deep, unnatural quiet as the night before. I hiked out fast, barely stopping for water. I didn't feel safe until I saw my truck. Even then, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone step out of the woods. I don't know what happened out there. I don't know who or what was walking around my camp. Maybe it was just some crazy person, someone living off the grid who got curious. Maybe it was something else. I don't think I'll ever know. But I do know one thing. I'm never going back. I was never the type to get spooked easily. I grew up hiking, hunting, and camping in all sorts of conditions, spending weeks deep in the woods where the only sounds at night were the wind through the trees and the occasional howl of a coyote. I trusted the outdoors, trusted my instincts. But there was one trip that changed everything for me. One night that made me realize the woods aren't as empty as they seem. It was late September, right when the first bite of fall starts to creep into the air. I had a few days off work and decided to take a solo camping trip to a place I hadn't been before. It was a remote stretch of forest in the Midwest, Not far from a state park, but far enough off the beaten path that I knew I wouldn't run into many people. That was the appeal. I wanted silence, solitude, just me and the trees. I parked my truck at a pull-off near an old, barely visible trailhead and started hiking in around noon. I had my pack loaded with enough food and supplies for 3 nights. The plan was simple. Hike about 5 miles in, set up camp near a creek I had seen on the map, and just enjoy being away from everything for a while. No phone service, no distractions, just the woods. The hike in was uneventful, exactly what I wanted. The forest was dense, the path mostly overgrown but still manageable. I saw plenty of deer tracks, even some bear scat, but nothing unusual. I reached the creek in the late afternoon, found a decent clearing a few yards from the water, and set up my tent. The air smelled like damp earth and fallen leaves, that rich, deep scent of autumn. It was peaceful. After setting up camp, I spent the rest of the evening collecting firewood and just enjoying the quiet. As the sun started to set, I got a fire going, cooked a simple meal, and settled into the rhythm of the night. The woods were alive with sound, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Felt normal, safe. At some point, maybe around 10, I crawled into my tent and zipped myself in. The temperature had dropped, but I was warm in my sleeping bag. I fell asleep fast, listening to the soft murmuring of the creek nearby. I don't know what woke me up. 1 second, I was asleep. The next, I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling of my tent. The fire outside had burned down to embers, casting a faint, flickering light through the fabric. I held my breath, listening. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Anyone who's spent enough time outdoors knows that silence is never really silence. Even at night, there's always some noise, the distant call of an animal, the wind shifting through the trees. But now there was nothing. Not even the sound of the creek. It was as if the entire forest had gone still. I lay there, straining to hear anything. Then, just on the edge of my awareness, I caught it. Footsteps, slow, careful, moving through the underbrush just outside my camp. At first, I thought it was an animal. A deer, maybe, but deer don't move like that. These steps were deliberate, measured. Something or someone was walking around my camp, trying not to make a sound. I stayed completely still, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife I kept near my sleeping bag. My breathing was shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. I listened as the footsteps moved, circling my camp. They would stop for a few seconds, then start again, shifting direction slightly each time. I wanted to believe it was nothing. Maybe a raccoon sniffing around for scraps. Maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. I've been in the woods long enough to recognize when something isn't right. Then the sound stopped. No footsteps. No movement. For a long time, I lay there, every muscle in my body tense. I don't know how much time passed before I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, my knife clutched tightly in my hand. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy, the memory of the night before hanging over me like a bad dream. I forced myself to shake it off, probably just a restless night, nothing more. But then I stepped out of my tent. The ground around my campsite was disturbed. The dirt, the leaves, someone had been walking there, and they hadn't bothered to cover their tracks. My stomach turned as I scanned the area. The footprints were human, not boot prints, bare feet, and they were fresh. I packed up my camp in record time. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. I hiked back to my truck without stopping, without looking back. The whole time, I felt watched, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. I never reported it, never told anyone the full story. What would I even say? That I went camping alone and got spooked? That I found footprints in the dirt? It wasn't a crime to walk barefoot in the woods, but I knew I wasn't alone that night, and I haven't been back since. I had been looking forward to this trip for months, a solo camping trip deep in the woods, away from the noise of everyday life. I'd done this plenty of times before, packing light, hiking deep into the wilderness, and setting up camp far from any marked trails. There was something about the isolation that felt peaceful. Just me, the trees, and the sounds of nature. The drive out took about 4 hours, and by the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was high in the sky. The weather was perfect. Crisp air, not too hot, not too cold. I parked my truck, double-checked my gear, and started hiking. The first few miles were easy, mostly flat terrain with the occasional fallen log to step over. I knew this area well enough, but I had chosen to push further in than I ever had before. I wanted complete solitude. By late afternoon, I found the perfect spot, an open clearing near a small creek. The nearest marked trail was at least 5 miles back. This was exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and sat down to take in the silence. The wind moved through the trees, the occasional bird call echoed through the air, and the steady trickle of water from the creek filled the gaps in between. No traffic, no voices, no distractions. As the sun set, I got a fire going and cooked a quick meal. Everything felt normal, peaceful. But as darkness settled in, I started feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Unease. I couldn't place it at first. I wasn't afraid of the woods, and I had never been the kind of person to spook easily. But something just felt off. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I wasn't used to this level of isolation anymore. I forced myself to relax and focused on the fire. Crackled steadily, sending sparks into the night. The trees swayed slightly, their shadows stretching and shifting. I ate, cleaned up, and decided to call it a night. Inside my tent, I lay still, listening. The wind had died down, and the forest was unusually quiet. Too quiet. Normally, I would hear the rustling of small animals, the occasional hoot of an owl, or the distant yips of coyotes. But tonight, there was nothing. I told myself it was fine, that I was just overthinking things. But then I heard it, a snap, like a twig breaking underfoot. It was faint but close. My heartbeat picked up. Probably just a deer, I told myself, maybe a raccoon. But then I heard it again. A second snap, closer this time, followed by another. It wasn't the erratic movement of an animal. It was steady, slow, deliberate. I stayed perfectly still, my ears straining to pick up any other sound. For a long time, there was nothing, just silence. I waited, barely breathing, my fingers gripping the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. I woke up suddenly to the sound of movement just outside my tent. Something was walking around my campsite. I lay frozen, my mind racing. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Not an animal, not a bear. A bear wouldn't move like this. My heart pounded against my ribs. I stayed as quiet as possible, gripping my knife so tightly my hand ached. The footsteps circled my tent. Once, twice, then they stopped, right outside. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and fast. Then, the quiet sound of fabric shifting. Someone or something was touching my tent. My stomach turned to ice. I couldn't just sit there and wait. I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight, and flicked it on, shining it directly at the side of the tent. The movement stopped immediately. I held my breath, listening, waiting for something to happen. And then, without warning, the footsteps retreated, quick but controlled, moving away from my tent, deeper into the trees. I waited, listening to the sound fading into the distance. Then, nothing. Silence again. I didn't move for a long time. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a person? A hunter who got lost? Someone messing with me? If it was an animal, why would it act like that? And why did it leave the second I shined my light? I barely slept the rest of the night. Every small sound made me jolt awake. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I was already packing up. I had planned to stay 2 nights, but there was no way I was sticking around. As I stepped out of my tent, I scanned the ground for footprints. There were some, human, barefoot, leading from the trees to my tent and then back into the woods. I felt a sick wave of fear wash over me. Someone had been out here watching me, walking around my campsite, touching my tent. I didn't waste another second. I packed up as fast as I could, barely stopping to eat. My mind kept replaying the sound of those slow, deliberate footsteps, the way they circled me, the way they stopped right outside. By the time I made it back to my truck, I was drenched in sweat, my nerves shot. I threw my gear into the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. As I turned the key, I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I didn't look back as I pulled out onto the road. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I still love camping. I still go on solo trips, but I never go as deep into the woods anymore. I never leave marked trails. And no matter how peaceful it seems, I always sleep with my knife in my hand, because out there in the middle of nowhere, you never really know who or what might be watching. I never liked camping much, but my brother Mike convinced me to go. "It'll be good for you," he said. "Get away from the noise. Clear your head." Maybe he was right. I'd been stressed with work, and my sleep was trash. I figured a weekend out in the woods wouldn't kill me. We packed light: a tent, sleeping bags, some food, and a couple of beers. Nothing fancy. The spot Mike picked was about a 2-hour drive out of town. Deep in the woods, away from everything. No cell service, no roads after a certain point. Just trees, dirt, and silence. It was late afternoon when we got there. The sun hung low, casting long shadows between the trees. The place was beautiful, I'll admit. Tall pines stretched high into the sky, and the air smelled fresh, untouched. A small stream ran nearby, trickling softly over rocks. Felt peaceful. We set up camp, got a fire going, and cooked some canned food. The night settled in quickly. The air turned cold, and the fire became our only source of light. Mike talked a lot, but I mostly just listened. He was excited about the trip, but I felt uneasy. Maybe it was just being out in the open, no walls, no locks, just the dark pressing in around us. We went to bed around midnight. The tent was small, barely enough space for both of us. I laid there for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets, the wind through the trees, an occasional rustling in the bushes. Normal stuff, but then I heard something different. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching over dried leaves and twigs. I held my breath, my mind racing. Could have been an animal, maybe a deer, but something felt off. The steps were steady, too measured. They stopped right outside the tent. I waited. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then, after a long pause, the steps moved away. I exhaled slowly, probably just my imagination. I turned onto my side, forcing myself to relax. Sleep finally took over. The next morning, I woke up to Mike already up and poking at the fire pit. The air was crisp, and the sunlight filtered through the trees. It felt silly to be so freaked out over nothing. We spent the day hiking, exploring the woods. It was nice. By the time we got back to camp, I'd almost forgotten about the footsteps. Almost. That night, we sat around the fire, drinking and joking around. The woods felt less intimidating with the flames crackling beside us. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. I felt more relaxed this time, convinced last night had been in my head. Then I heard it again. The same slow, deliberate steps, coming closer, closer. I could tell Mike heard it too. His breathing changed, grew shallow. Neither of us moved. The steps stopped just outside the tent, same as before. Silence. Then, the unmistakable sound of fabric shifting. Someone was touching the tent. My blood ran cold. My mind screamed at me to do something, but I was frozen. A hand pressed against the thin material, sliding downward. And then, nothing. The presence retreated. The footsteps faded into the woods. We lay there, unmoving, until the sun came up. Morning light made everything feel ridiculous. We checked around the camp but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anything out of place. But we both knew what we heard. "We should go," Mike said finally. I didn't argue. We packed up fast, stuffing our gear into our packs without care. We were about to head out when Mike stopped, his face pale. I followed his gaze. A little ways from our tent, carved into the bark of a tree, were 3 words. "You were lucky." My stomach twisted. The cuts were fresh, the edges of the letters raw. Someone had done this last night. We left without another word, hiking back to the car as fast as we could. The whole drive home, neither of us spoke. I don't know who was out there. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing for sure. I'll never go camping again. The drive out to the campsite was smooth, nothing out of the ordinary. The sun was just starting to set when I pulled into the dirt lot near the tree line. It was a primitive site, the kind with no amenities besides a fire ring and a flat patch of land for a tent. That was fine by me. I wanted the solitude. The idea of being surrounded by nothing but the woods for a few days sounded like the perfect way to clear my head. I parked my truck, turned off the engine, and stepped out. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just the distant call of some bird and the quiet hum of insects waking up for the night. I grabbed my pack from the truck bed and slung it over my shoulder before heading toward the site I had scouted out on the map. It was about a 15-minute walk from the parking area, nestled between a rocky outcrop and a slow-moving creek. By the time I reached it, the sun was dipping below the trees, painting everything in deep oranges and purples. I worked quickly to set up my tent, laying down the tarp first, then securing the poles and stretching out the rainfly. I was efficient, practiced. It didn't take me long. Once the tent was up, I gathered some firewood, stacking it neatly by the ring before pulling out my lighter. The fire caught easily, the dry kindling popping as flames curled around the larger logs. I sat on a fallen tree trunk a few feet from the fire, warming my hands. The night had settled in quickly. I hadn't noticed how quiet the woods had gotten. Normally, the sounds of crickets and distant owls filled the background, but now there was nothing, just the occasional crackle from the fire. I shook it off. Sometimes nature had these odd quiet moments. Maybe a predator was nearby, a fox or a coyote passing through. I wasn't worried. I had my knife on me, and my rifle was back in the tent. I wasn't far from my truck either. After eating a quick meal, I decided to turn in early. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, listening to the silence. Eventually, I must have dozed off because I woke up feeling stiff, my body cold despite the thick layers. Something had pulled me from sleep, but I didn't know what. I listened. It was still quiet, too quiet. Then a sound, soft, deliberate. Footsteps crunching on the dirt just outside my tent. I held my breath. My mind raced. I hadn't heard a car pull up. No one else was supposed to be out here. Another step. Closer. I slowly reached for my knife, gripping the handle tight, my knuckles white. My rifle was just out of reach. If I unzipped the tent, I'd be exposed. I waited, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped just outside. Then silence. Minutes stretched. My heartbeat was so loud I could hear it in my ears. Nothing. I forced myself to relax, my muscles aching from the tension. Maybe it was an animal, a deer, something passing through. I stayed still for another few minutes before finally letting my eyes close again. When I woke up, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the thin fabric of the tent. Everything looked normal. No tracks outside. No signs of anything being disturbed. Maybe I'd imagined it. I went about my day as planned, hiking up the ridge nearby, taking in the view. It was beautiful, peaceful. Still, the feeling from last night clung to me, that unease. When I got back to camp, I noticed something small near the fire pit. A footprint. Not mine. Not a boot. A bare footprint. The dirt around it was dry, meaning it had been made sometime after the morning dew had burned off. I felt the air go cold around me. There was no reason for someone to be out here barefoot. No reason for them to be near my site without making their presence known. I packed up my things as fast as I could, shoving everything into my bag without care. My gut told me to leave, and I wasn't about to ignore it. I walked fast, rifle slung over my shoulder, eyes scanning the trees as I made my way back to my truck. My nerves were on edge, but I didn't see anything. No movement, no sound. When I got to the truck, I threw my gear in the back and climbed in, locking the doors before starting the engine. The tires spun in the dirt as I peeled out of the lot. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road, heading toward town. My hands were gripping the wheels so tight they ached. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't want to know. I haven't been camping alone since, and I never will again.